Hi, everybody. Pastor Tom, just returning from a week of vacation. It's been great to have a week of rest and renewal. I hope that you are continuing to remain faithful to your readings in the Bible in 365. We come today to week 28. You're doing great. We're on the downward slope. We're in the second half of the year. It was kind of an interesting week, wasn't it? Interesting, maybe even isn't the word you'd use for it, but that was a lot of names in the first 9 chapters of Chronicles. Those were some long genealogies. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in just a moment. But let's dive in and get ourselves ready for week 28 in the Bible of 365. First, I just want to share with you the Bible reading tip of the week. So, my tip this week is to try reading the epistles, that's the New Testament letters, out loud and in one sitting, just as the original audience would have heard them. So let me tell you a little bit more about this. So later this week, you're going to be asked in our daily readings to read the letter of Colossians in one sitting. We did this a few weeks ago with the letter of the Philippians. Now, on one level, it seems like we're shortchanging these letters, right? Because they're so rich and deep in spiritual truth. But on another level, this plan gives us the opportunity to read these letters as they would have been heard by the original audience. So remember that whether it was Paul or Peter or John who was writing these letters were written to congregations of people, many of whom could not read. And so what would happen is when the letter from Paul arrived, the congregation, the church would gather, and somebody would open the letter and they would read the whole thing from beginning to end out loud to the entire congregation. Now, it's true that they would then spend time reflecting on pieces and parts of the letter, but they always started by reading the whole thing. I mean, think about it. If you write a letter to somebody, you don't expect them to just read a couple of sentences and then put the letter away and maybe come back to it later. No, you expect them to read the whole letter at once. Well, the same was true for Paul or Peter or John or whoever was writing these letters that we find in the New Testament. They were expecting them to be read all at once. So give it a try. This week, when you get to the Colossians day, try reading the whole letter out loud, or have somebody in your family read the letter out loud to you. And in that way, you'll begin to get a sense of what the whole meaning of the letter is, and you'll hear it as it was actually intended to be heard. All right. Well, this week's readings, we do continue in First Chronicles. We're going to get the rest of the way through First Chronicles. We're out of the genealogies now. We'll get a little more narrative. And then we'll have that day in Colossians. And then the last day of this week, we'll begin Second Chronicles. So we've got a ton of Chronicles coming up here in the next 2 weeks. So let me tell you a little bit about Chronicles and what it is that Chronicles is all about. So in the book of Chronicles, what we have is a reframing of the past in order to provide hope for the present. So because Chronicles repeats a lot of stories that we've already heard in the books of Samuel and Kings, it's tempting for us to skip over Chronicles altogether. But that would be to miss the point of Chronicles. So remember, Chronicles was compiled sometime after the Israelites returned from exile in Babylon. They had labored hard to rebuild Jerusalem, to rebuild its wall, to rebuild the temple, and yet they were struggling. They could not recapture the glory of Jerusalem in previous eras. And so there was discouragement in that time. So the compiler of Chronicles, who may possibly have been Ezra, is compiling these stories of the past with the purpose of helping the people of Israel find some hope for the future. And so we see two real themes that come out in Chronicles. The first is this theme of how we can look to the past and see that God has promised a coming Messiah out of the line of David, and this coming Messiah will restore the hopes and fortunes of Israel. And the second theme is the theme of the future of the temple. While the temple that was rebuilt after exile wasn't as beautiful or magnificent as the first one, there is still a future for the temple as the presence of God among the people of Israel. And we actually see those themes developed from the beginning of Chronicles. Consider the genealogies in chapters 1 to 9. Now, it looks to us like just a lot of names, but if you read it closely, you'll see that there are two family lines that are focused on. First, we have the family line of Judah, out of whom comes David, and that's the family line of the promised Messiah. Second, we have a focus on the family of Aaron out of the tribe of Levi. These are the priests, the people who are going to provide leadership in the temple. So even the genealogies are meant to set up these twin themes of the coming of the Messiah out of David's line and God's continued presence among the Israelites through the temple. Now, in chapters 10 to 29 that we'll read this week, we'll see some repeated stories about David, some stories we've heard before. But you'll notice that none of the negative stories about David are included in Chronicles. Instead, all the stories really hold up David in a positive light. Now, the purpose is not to deny that David was an imperfect sinner like you and me. The purpose, rather, is to lift up David's godly qualities as what the model of a true Davidic king looks like, and to say this coming Messiah out of David's line is going to fulfill and live into all these good and positive qualities. You'll also notice in Chronicles that we do get some new stories about David that we haven't heard before. For example, we're told about David's planning for the building of the temple, a temple that David himself will not build, but David actually plans for it and actually rallies the community together to collect resources necessary to build the temple. So as you're reading Chronicles, consider this. Chronicles is about framing the stories of the past to provide hope for the present. And I think that so much of what preaching is, what pastors like me do, is really looking at these stories from the Bible, stories of God's promises and faithfulness from the past, and framing them for the present moment. How has what God has done in the past given us a reason to have hope and energy and expectancy in the present moment? That's exactly what Chronicles is trying to do. Now, that said, let's get ourselves ready for that one day in which we're going to read the letter of Colossians. So Colossians is another one of Paul's letters that was written while Paul was in prison, just like Philippians was. But Colossians is a little bit different in that it's written to the church at the city of Colossae. And Paul actually never met these believers before. He was not the founder of this church. Instead, this church was founded by one of Paul's colleagues, a man named Epaphras. And Epaphras visited Paul while Paul was in prison, and he gave Paul an update on the church at Colossae. And he said, look, the Christians at Colossae are undergoing great social and cultural pressure. They're being pressured to give up on their faithfulness of Jesus. And so the theme of this letter that Paul writes is a theme of faithfulness in the face of the pressures of life. And Paul writes this letter to encourage the Colossians to remain faithful in the face of those pressures. And the letter comes in four primary segments. First, in the opening verses, we have this poetic and majestic reflection on who Jesus is. Jesus is the exalted one. He's the firstborn of all creation. He's the image of the invisible God, and he's the one through whom salvation comes into the world. So Jesus is just lifted high at the beginning of the letter. And then in light of who Jesus is, Paul talks about the reasons why he is suffering as he is as an apostle. And he uses that as a bridge into encouraging the Colossian church to remain rooted in Christ, this exalted Christ, amid all of the pressures that they're facing. And then in chapters 3 and 4, Paul talks about a new way of life that's made possible by the resurrection of Jesus. And he really calls on the Colossian church to live into this new way of life, even when it goes against the grain of the surrounding world. Now, as you read Colossians this week, I want you to consider that all of us as followers of Jesus face things in life that put pressure on our faith, things that maybe push us to live differently than Jesus would call us to live. And so as those who sometimes face pressures that test our faith, ask yourself, what encouragement do you find in the book of Colossians? What encouragement does this letter give you to carry on in faithfulness to Jesus? All right. I hope you have a great week as you continue to read the Bible in 365, and I'll see you right back here next week as we continue our readings.